everyone. I am Sarah Falvo, Director of Community at the Arcview Group, and I want to welcome you to our special edition Vape Workshop today. We have some great guests on from both Green Tank and Marijuana Packaging, who will be giving you some things to think about in terms of the vape market. It's a topic that has been top of mind for the industry as one of the most popular cannabis in the market, as well as controversial at times. Today, we will look at where where have we been and where we will be going with the vape market. We will look at our experiences in established markets such as California and Colorado, as well as regions that are on the cusp like Missouri, Illinois, and Massachusetts. Regulations have been changing, and what does that mean for state-by-state legalization, product assortment, and consumer trends? Before we dig in, let me reintroduce you to the Arcview Group. Our organization has evolved quite a bit over the last 2 years, along with our industry. And now we have a few subsidiaries, including Arcview Capital, which is our FINRA licensed broker-dealer, and they provide investment banking services and now also offer a crowdfunding site. We also have Arcview Consulting, which is a very capable management team who are standing at the ready for those of you who are in cannabis license pursuit and seeking growth strategy services. Additionally, we have Arcview Ventures, which is our principal investing group that Jeff Finkel and Gene Sullivan run along with our Arcview Collective Fund. We've made 15 investments and currently have 78 investor members. We welcome you to reach out to us if you have a company that you would like us to review. Additionally, we also have Arcview Marketing Services for all your asset and branding needs. A poll is going to pop up on your screen, so please take a minute to fill that out, or you can put it to the side and fill it out later in the program. So today's webinar will feature information provided by our latest vape report, which was co-authored with Green Tank. So download your copy today, and my colleague will drop that link in the chat shortly, and please check that out. And also, for more information about the Arcview Group, check out our website, www.arcviewgroup.com, or on our social media. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Now, let me introduce your moderator today, David Abernathy, principal of our Arcview Consulting division. Take it away, David.
Hello, and thanks, Sarah. Great to be here talking about the evolution of vapes again. There really is never a dull moment in this industry. And that's, I think, evidenced by the fact that a category that is at this point as mature as vapes is still evolving pretty rapidly. So I'd love to bring on the panelists that we've got here for this. We've got Derek Shampoo, VP of Brand and Marketing at Green Tank, Dave Wright, Chief Revenue Officer at Green Tank, and Jesse Wetherill, VP of Sales at Marijuana Packaging. Great to have all of you here today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, David.
So just at a high level, let's start by talking about what was different in 2021 versus 2020 or previous years when it comes to vape trends.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in and take the first one. Maybe take a first stab at it. 2021, I think, comparatively to 2020, you have to look at I think you have to look at COVID and what it did economically. We're starting to see some very interesting sales trends with some products that lend itself to tourism, like the disposable side of the vape industry. In 2020, a lot of travel restrictions were put in place, so a lot of folks were staying at home. But now that folks are out and about, they're moving all over the country. We're starting to see different, sales trends, like, a rise in disposables in pretty much every single market that we cover, which I thought was fairly interesting.
Yeah, I think COVID has brought about some really interesting changes in terms of consumer behavior and preferred form factor across the cannabis industry. We're seeing, for example, with things like pre-rolls, people moving towards pre-roll packs as they start to get back out and go to events and get together with their friends, where prior to the pandemic, they might have preferred sort of a big 1 or 1.5 gram pre-roll. Now that they would sort of pass around to their friends. Now they're preferring these packs of smaller joints so they can still share joints, but not actually have to share the individual joint.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, David, because we're seeing that even with the customers we speak with. You're seeing more of the dog walker trend of joints in the pre-roll side. And we see it on the vape side too, right? Folks are going for the larger tank size now, but keeping it kind of close to their chest and less sharing. So when you talk about some of the consumer trends and the things that have changed at the ground level, that's definitely one. Cannabis sales are spiking across the board, but it's more individualized and folks wanting to hold on versus sharing at a party, which may have been the trend back in 2019, early 2020, before COVID really struck us on the side of the head for the past 18 months.
Indeed, there's it's interesting that on the vape side, it seems to be going in a different direction in terms of the size that people are preferring. And I think one of the reasons for that is it wasn't uncommon to sort of share a vape cartridge prior to the pandemic and then maybe have it go missing at a party. So if you're going to do that, it makes sense to have a smaller, cheaper one that doesn't matter as much if it goes missing. But if you're not going to be sharing it, if you're going to be hanging on to it, you're less likely to lose it, and you can go for those larger sizes.
Yeah, and I think that's a go ahead, Dave.
No. I was just going to say it kind of follows the same trend of folks starting to also understand what they like, right? So on the vape side, you're seeing the tank size grow, people keeping it a little bit closer to their chest. And same with the dog walker trend that you're seeing on pre-rolled joints is, I know what I like. If somebody wants to try one, I'll pass it off. And when you break it down to unit cost, it's $2.50. It's something that you're okay to share with a friend versus passing over a 1 gram joint to somebody where you're going, $10, $12. Maybe they can get their own.
Yeah. And I think on our end, one of the things that I'm seeing from the vape brands we work with is really a more targeted shelf space. You're either going for an economy brand or a top shelf brand. The middle of the road shelf space seems to be a little bit more neglected these days. So brands are really developing their identity around what shelf space they're targeting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Dave, right? You've said something around, the cannabis industry hasn't slowed down, and that's certainly been true in 2021. I mean, kind of going back to the vape report that we put out, like for instance, Oregon, in Q3 this year, it was the 5th straight month of record-breaking vape sales. Nevada was the 3rd straight record-breaking sales month. And when we're seeing that, California, Washington, Pennsylvania, Michigan, they're all having record-breaking months and quarters in 2021. It definitely hasn't slowed down.
Absolutely. So as the industry evolves, there are more and more new markets coming online. What have you noticed about the differences between some of the more mature markets like California and Colorado versus some of the newer markets like Missouri, Illinois, and Massachusetts?
Yeah, it's from a vape perspective, and I'd love, Jesse, in a sec to hear your point of view from packaging, what you see from a more holistic view across, what's being sold on your end. The mature markets, they battle a little bit more of the black market. So they're mature in the sense that they've been around prior to legalization in that state. We even see it up in Canada. British Columbia is very OG culture, as they say. There's a lot of black market out there, so a lot of black market grow ops. Versus the Northeast and Midwest, where you're seeing these states start to turn on and move over into recreational. They're not battling the black market like they are on the West Coast. May that be in California, Oregon, Washington, or even Colorado. The other piece is because that there's a nice maturity to folks understanding what they want. So you're seeing those sales slowly start to trend over, where in new markets, it's a lot more of kind of that trial and error, testing what I like, what I don't like. May that be flower, edibles, drinkables, or vape. Hence the, slowly in the vape side, you saw 0.3s were big about 2 years ago in some of these underserved and newer markets. Then it moved to half grams, and now we're into the 1 grams. Really just follows that trend kind of, west towards east.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels between the vape market and the packaging side of things. On the packaging side of things in established markets, those customers really want to have branded packaging delivered to them, as opposed to new emerging markets that are more okay with stock product and ready to just dip their toes in the water that way. You mentioned California. That's where I'm residing these days. California market is completely crushed right now by the black market. The price of a pound right now is the lowest it's been in the last 5 or 10 years, which is making it extremely difficult for operators in the state to retain their margin. So we're seeing that play out on the shelf space.
Yeah, and that trend carries over onto the vape side as well. A lot of folks that are entering into the market typically go with something that's unbranded, very stock. And as they start to figure out where they fit, and Jesse, to your point earlier, are they top tier, mid tier, or low tier from, again, more of a price point than a quality standpoint, they then start to dial in their branding around that once they've found product market fit. Where some of these larger folks that you see out in the market, they've already got their SKU set. They know where they sit on the shelves, and they just go full tilt against that with fully customized packaging. May that be child resistance all the way to the cartridge being child resistance. And it's really interesting to see those trends start to shift again from kind of the West Coast over into the East.
So we've talked a little bit about Canada and a little bit about the sort of things like these 1 gram cartridges, larger cartridge sizes becoming more popular. And here we have a really sort of great example of that. Any thoughts on a market like Ontario, where we're seeing, 908% increase in 1 gram unit sales is kind of a ridiculous number.
It is, yeah. Like for context, sorry, Dave, sorry to cut you off.
No, jump in.
The beginning of 2020 was really kind of the first introduction into vape. Cannabis 2.0 up in Canada launched in 2019, but it really didn't launch until the beginning of 2020. And so I think there was, like Dave kind of mentioned, there was this natural progression from users, kind of easing into this category. Cannabis 1.0 back in 2018 in Canada, it was just flower. And so folks got used to, buying flower legally, how they could do it from a legal standpoint. And then, same deal when vapes came online a year later, that same sort of like small progression. And then again, like to Dave's point, in newer emerging markets, you're seeing folks like test out, 0.35s or half gram cartridges. And then now that the market has been maturing over the last year or two, we're starting to see that trend that, California and Colorado quickly went into with the larger tank sizes in the 1 gram units.
Yeah, and another thing to layer on just to the 908.6% growth you see there, it wasn't until late 2020, almost towards the tail end of Q3, that 1 grams were even on the shelves in Canada. So that's a piece that might throw off the data a little bit, but what we're seeing now is a huge trend continuing towards 1 grams, and those half grams being those nice, steady eddies right in the middle, nice to have on the shelf. So it's been really interesting to follow, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but it's really put a crunch on supply chain when it comes to just getting organized and figuring out where the market's heading. There were a lot of folks in Ontario specifically that had to make some very quick pivots over basically this time last year into the 1 gram space.
Excellent. One of the things going through the sort of the broader data that I noticed is there seems to be more jostling for top brands in the Canadian market than there is in many parts of the U.S. market. Any thoughts on that difference there?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, I think there could be 2 factors into this, and again, this could be just my speculation. Well, the first one's mergers and acquisitions. We've seen so many mergers, acquisitions over the last 12, 16 months that are now coming to fruition. And so like a lot of these brands are doing some shuffling. I think that's a big one. The second part of that is at the beginning of Canadian legalization, a lot of these licensed producers were, going public. They were IPOing, and the cash flow into this industry was crazy. And I think a lot of these larger, maybe more established brands at the time were using this cash infusion to get to the market a little bit quicker. I think, maybe some of these smaller, maybe craft, small to medium-sized LPs, they really took their time to, hone in on the messaging of their brand, hone in on their formulations, and really, set the foundation for a strategy into launch. And now you're starting to see that all of that hard work come to fruition now in 2021. It just comes to show you that, quality, reliability, and performance, kind of wins out at the end of the day.
In the Canadian market, it is, as you touched on, the messaging of the brands is more challenging because they don't have the shelf space or the packaging space to provide that message to the end user. Whereas, here in the United States and in California, your package can be your brand. In Canada, that's not the case.
It's so true.
Yeah, for folks who haven't seen Canadian cannabis packaging, it is just about the dullest thing you can possibly imagine, by virtue of the regulations around what you can or specifically can't put on packaging in the Canadian market.
It's pretty medicinal for a recreational coast to coast market.
Oh.
Yeah. Erica, can you go to the next slide? So let's talk about a U.S. market that's really experienced quite a bit of evolution over the course of the past year. Michigan, any thoughts, anything that stands out about a market like Michigan?
Yeah, I guess the question would be where to begin. They've done a really good job from our point of view on getting distribution set up and rolling out retail licenses. In comparison to some of the other states, they've done a good job of just blanketing, and not just in highly populated areas, but more remote areas, with a couple dispensaries doing a very good job of creating single state operations or chains throughout Michigan. And on our end, having done a lot of work there, they've also done a very good job at some of the regulations that they're putting on vape, similar to 2019, what we saw back in California in the heavy metal crisis. California test for 4. I always blank on these. It's arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury in California. Jesse, I know you laugh because we had this conversation a while ago, and Michigan does all 4 of those, but then they add on chromium, copper, and nickel. And that caused a bit of a headache on the vape side as they started to turn the market on. And from a green tank standpoint, we did a bunch of testing prior, knowing that we would be able to not only help sell into the states, but really help guide some of the folks that needed to understand some of the requirements of coming to life in a new market. And Michigan's done a really good job at executing against that. So much so that states like Maryland, as they start to turn on, are copying many lines from the bills and legislation that's been passed through in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, it's been great seeing the market evolve in Michigan. I've got friends who have operated in Michigan for years now, and we also have clients who are in the process of setting up operations in Michigan, and just seeing they haven't done everything right, but they've gotten a lot more right than a whole lot of states where we see really problematic markets.
That's the key. It's I don't think anybody has gotten it right, may that be Canada or any states that have turned on. But if it's a score out of 10, they definitely didn't fail. And we're still struggling with it in Canada as well when it comes to province. There are little nuances from Ontario to Alberta to Saskatchewan, all the way down to the forms you have to fill out to release a product, or if you make a change to the packaging and or the unit itself. There's still some kinks to work out, but I think we forget that cannabis as a whole is only 3, 4, 5 years legal. That's the definition of the early stage of an industry.
Yeah. No kidding. Well, I mean, I got to address the number on here for disposable sales up 3,800%. And I know why that is. You kind of got to dive into the numbers a little bit. That's a very jarring number, but there is context. So, a year ago in Michigan, the disposable category only accounted for 0.01% of every vape sold in the market. So in Q3, it tracked to be about 4% of the entire market. So, that increases 3,800. But you can't get that confused. It's only 4% of the entirety of the market. So in Michigan, you go back to the 510 cartridge trend, where 1 gram cartridges actually account for 83% of every vape product sold in the state. So, huge number on a disposable increase and trend. But just take some of the numbers with a grain of salt.
Yeah, indeed. In especially new markets like cannabis, we often see these like insane growth rates in situations where, right, you'll have a market that comes online in December and posts a certain number of sales throughout a year, and the next year it's got thousands of percent growth. Well, yeah, because it had 4 days of sales in the prior year. So that context is super important, and one of the reasons you should download the full report and read more than just sort of these headline numbers, which can be directionally interesting, but as always, it's really important to sort of dig into the details of why these things are happening, especially when you see numbers like 3,800%.
Yeah, context is key.
Yeah. Another interesting tidbit about Michigan is that they have the 3rd highest population of legalized states when it comes to users. And they've done a really good job of being able to capture those people and keep them away from the unregulated market. They allow dispensaries in every county within their state, whereas another state like here, like in California where I'm at, many of the counties have outlawed cannabis. So if I wanted to go get cannabis, I actually have to travel outside of my county to get it. Whereas in Michigan, that's not the case. That's not a factor there.
Yeah, I've spoken with government officials from municipalities and states that are deciding whether or not they want to allow sales in markets like California or New Jersey, a more recent market that's coming online with that opt-out for municipalities. And what I always tell them is, look, you don't actually have a choice about whether cannabis sales are going to happen in your city or county. You only have a choice about whether or not you're going to have anything to say about those sales, whether you're going to regulate them, right? Like, regardless of what you decide to do, people will buy and consume cannabis in your municipality. So better to regulate it and have some say over how that happens.
Capture that tax revenue.
Indeed. And have, right, like we've seen markets like California where certainly the fact that a bunch of municipalities don't have legal sales is a problem, but so is the ridiculously high tax rate. I mean, even the hold that the unregulated market has in California, even in sort of municipalities that do allow for cannabis sales, is largely due to the fact that the legal market just can't compete. You see products on the legal market that are twice as expensive as products in the unregulated market, and most consumers are just not willing to pay that kind of a markup, despite the fact that, especially when you look at things like vape cartridges, where we've had problems with unregulated vape cartridges. They've caused health problems that we just have not seen in the regulated space. So it's a matter of both sort of creating a broader tax base by lowering taxes, as well as creating just a safer industry for consumers. Erica, let's go to the next slide and talk about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a really interesting state in that it's still medical only, but it's a gigantic state. and presumably at some point it will go adult use and be a really a large market to be reckoned with. Any thoughts on Pennsylvania?
Yeah, it's you're spot on. You know, just being medical and seeing some of the numbers that we're seeing out of Pennsylvania, like you can see on this graph. I think in Q3 2021, it surpassed over 2 million units sold alone, which is more than a lot of regulated states and a lot of provinces up in Canada where it's federally legal. You know, so we're seeing some huge growth opportunities in Pennsylvania. Again, just kind of point back to what we just saw in the Michigan state where the disposable sales were up an insane amount. You know, Pennsylvania was actually the only state that we covered that had a downward trend in the disposable side, which is why, you know, just even going back to understanding the markets that you're selling into and doing dives into consumer trends. You know, Pennsylvania is the perfect market to encapsulate, you know, that sentiment that, you know, despite what you're seeing across the country, you know, in Pennsylvania, you're seeing a completely different set of trends. So understanding it, you know, market by market is just so important. But, you know, for us, again, you know, disposable sales are down, but we're seeing the same types of trends that we're seeing in more mature rec markets like Colorado, Washington, California with, again, I know it sounds like a broken record, but 1 gram units, again, like, you know, trending upwards to be the more dominant SKU in that market. So, you know, we're seeing some really interesting things out of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it's kind of layering on to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago. Pennsylvania is also going through its troubles as it starts to really solidify itself on the vape side, where there's a lot of brands out there that now need to resubmit to the governing body for additional testing. So we're seeing, again, these hiccups as we start to get closer to recreational, may that be through the penetration point of medicinal and hopefully seeing that convert over. It doesn't come without its hiccups and headaches. And we've spoken with many brands that are currently just kind of sitting to see how it plays out. And some of them are very lucky just with the types of terpenes that they use. Others need to fully resubmit and reapply to get it back on shelves. So it'll be interesting to see the numbers at, you know, this time a couple months from now as we do the Q4 report and what's happened to any sales that may have happened in Pennsylvania in comparison to Q4 last year, just knowing that there is a current regulation hiccup that's happening in the state itself.
Yeah.
So one of the things that jumps out here is the best-selling cartridge is a Gorilla Glue number 4 liquid live resin cartridge. We've looked at some other markets where the number 1 selling cartridge is a distillate cartridge. Any thoughts on the sort of wider trends around things like distillate versus live resin, what people are actually filling cartridges with?
I think it's an interesting fork in the road right now, where, you know, as we talked about early on in this call, is that you have to pick a shelf space and kind of dive in fully towards that. Another interesting take from this slide is that the leaders are MSOs and GTI and Cresco. So even in an emerging state like Pennsylvania that still isn't fully go, the consolidation is already starting to occur. Yeah. So you see those kind of leading brands take the lead early on and really try to meet the customers' needs and demand for product.
We're seeing that also. It's a great point, Jesse. We're seeing that trend actually happening in Illinois as well, where MSOs are starting to dominate the landscape in there as well. It should be interesting to see on the Northeast as more and more states open up, if that's kind of the trend, because it is certainly not the case on the West Coast, especially California.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, ultimately, with federal legalization, it's a near certainty that eventually we'll move into a national market where wholesale sales will happen from state to state. Right now, in some of these states, especially these sort of Midwest and East Coast states, we have capture by a few big MSOs who have dominated the market, and there are a limited number of licenses, which they control most of or all of. And it will be interesting to see as that situation starts to shift, whether from sort of changes to state policy or the opening up of a national wholesale market, whether these MSOs can continue to sort of be dominant players with additional competition that, frankly, a lot of them are not having to deal with right now.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting, David, to see how some of these more craft and some of these smaller businesses attack live resin. They do a very good job doing it in small batches, just given the complexity to get a good live resin to shelf. It'll be very interesting to cross-compare that with some of the larger MSOs that are used to doing it in massive batches. So the consistency will be very, very interesting to track as the years go on, and we start to see that trend for that, more full spectrum, flavorful live resin versus your botanically infused distillates.
Yeah, I fully expect, and we've already started seeing this, right? That one thing that large companies are really bad at in any industry, right? Any non-durable goods business is producing craft brands, right? Like as hard as Budweiser tries to make Budweiser Select a thing, it's not. They can't capture certain elements of connoisseur markets and craft markets on their own. And so they acquire their way into those. And we see it over and over again in food, in alcohol, where a new sort of craft brand will emerge, start to gain traction among these sort of high-spending connoisseur audiences. When they get enough attention and enough traction, they'll get purchased by a big company who will, over the course of months or years, eventually dilute that sort of brand promise that they had as a small brand, and then the big companies are sort of back to the drawing board, and that kind of creates this sort of cycle of opportunity for people creating small brands to be able to build those brands and then have an exit opportunity at the end. Packaging. So let's talk a little bit about packaging. There's a lot. There are a lot of concerns around packaging and sustainability. At the same time, if you're in many markets, certainly not Canada, but in many markets, there's this like need to stand out on shelves. And so companies are spending more on packaging and sort of looking for new ways to be differentiated from a packaging standpoint. And often that means sort of less sustainability. Any thoughts on the trends in packaging and the sort of push-pull between getting something that stands out and also not creating as much plastic and paper waste?
Yeah, it's always a delicate balance on a razor's edge, right? In packaging, just because of the compliance that's required from state to state. A lot of these brands would like to be more responsible when it comes to single-use packaging, but it's hard to fit all the compliance that they need on a small package. So we've taken a big dive into sustainable packaging here at Marijuana Packaging. We actually just started another pillar of our business called Green Earth Packaging, where all of the packaging sold out of that platform is going to be sustainable. So the demand to be able to be sustainable and also stand out, we're definitely gaining some traction there. We're trying to put focus on it so we can drive the industry in the right direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that because the packaging regulations, the labeling regulations are different from state to state. As we see the emergence of these brands that do operate in multiple states, they have to create, in many cases, custom packaging and custom labeling for every state that they operate in, which is just not something that we see in other spaces, right? If you buy, a bottle of Stoli vodka in California, it looks the same as it does in Massachusetts, or a bag of Doritos chips, right? It's, I think, something that regulators often overlook, but it's a big deal from a logistics standpoint and a supply chain standpoint for companies that are operating in multiple states to have to create different packaging for each of their SKUs in each of those states that they operate in.
It's an exceptional challenge, especially with the constraints today in the supply chain. And demand for a singular product here in the state of California may be much different than in Arizona. So it's not like these brands can do a straight across, equivalent for what they're trying to order. They really have to try and balance it out and keep their packaging as flexible as possible when it comes to their labeling, so that they can try to retain those brand likenesses, but also meet the compliance requirements for those states.
Yeah, we've seen several instances of state packaging or labeling requirements changing, and brands who had ordered sort of a large surplus of inventory in anticipation of using those over time, having to either throw away a really large amount of packaging or slap big ugly stickers on things to comply with whatever new labeling regulations are coming through. So there's been for a lot of vape brands kind of a race to the bottom when it comes to pricing in a lot of markets. At the same time, there are other brands that are sort of doing pretty well at a higher price point. Any thoughts on what's happening there with respect to pricing and what brands can do to sort of capitalize on different market segments and opportunities?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Green Tank being a B2B business, we have tons of discussion around price specifically and packaging and unit size, but also a strong understanding of what is working in the market and what's not. And speaking very openly, a big portion of this is the quality of oil. And to Jesse's point earlier in our discussion, where it sits on the shelves, right? So making sure that the oil matches the expectations of the consumer themselves. What we see on our end is, for argument's sake, if a vape cartridge costs $2, 2 or 3 cents off of that makes a significant difference to the overall margin at what they're selling to, may that be the board and or the end retailer. So that price compression is not only on the end consumer side, we're seeing it as the B2B sales, but we're also seeing the opposite happening in China, given all the supply chain issues. We're seeing the cost of BOM go up. We're seeing the price compression from the end user, and then we're getting squeezed in our business with those folks in the middle being the MSO, single state operators, or LPs in Canada. But really, it comes down to it's the long game, in my opinion. You don't want to cheap out on the hardware itself. You want to make sure that it's reliable, it's safe, it passes all the heavy metal tests. You want to make sure that your packaging is in compliance with any state that you're putting something on the shelves. And then you can't cheap out on your extraction process. You need to make sure that you're doing a good job with clean, trustworthy oil. And that, to me, all will come out and pay dividends down the road as this market continues to mature.
Yeah, I mean, as a consumer, one thing that fortunately has started to become less of a problem, but certainly is still a problem depending on where I find myself in the country, is leaky cartridges. And if I buy a vape cartridge from a brand and it leaks, I'm never going to buy a vape cartridge from that brand again, right? Like that's the end of this customer. It's like, it's such an inconvenience and kind of gross to have like a sticky mess in your bag or your pocket. And
then you try to return it and it's impossible, right? So returning anything in the cannabis space, it's not like alcohol. If it's unsealed, you can return it to the liquor store. At least you can in Canada. On the cannabis side and vape specifically, the moment you walk out of that retail location, it's yours. You can log a complaint, but that $30, $40, $50, $100, it's gone. And that's why I come back to what I was just saying of to shave and save 3 to 10 cents on a cartridge and erode your end user and customer isn't worth it in the long term. I understand the price compression across the board, and same thing goes with compliance on packaging. And Jesse, I'm sure you've seen this a ton as well, where folks want to shave 10, 15 cents off of a box. But if you put risk on the compliance side, you might not have a box to put on the shelf because you cut a corner. And in my opinion, it's about the long game, not the quick buck that you're trying to make, because you may have, acquired a good chunk of the market, but that market's going to leave you if your carts leak, if they clog. And I'm not saying that, not every cart, has a failure rate of some percentage, but when you cut 10, 15, 20 cents off, you're now getting in that direct to China model where they can't even touch and handle oil, versus, ourselves and even competitors in our space where we understand vape, we understand how the oil interacts with the atomizers and how heating works and, leaking and solving some of these issues. And in Canada, we've got an R&D license, so we can actually touch and play with the oil itself, versus feedback that just goes overseas and they make a tweak and it comes back, but you still have a 5% failure rate. To your point, David, the odds of you ever buying that cartridge again are probably slim to none.
Yeah. You said pretty much everything there, Dave. It's really around, from like a back end, like kind of a B2B side, it's really around messaging, education. In this industry, you kind of said it, David, but you really do pay for what you get. And on the vape sector, you're paying for peace of mind. Peace of mind and safety, in performance, in quality, in design and reliability. I've been at Green Tank for over 4 years now in the vape space, and I can't even count the amount of times that folks might have wavered on a deal because of a couple cents on margin, and I can almost set my watch to 3 to 6 months later getting a phone call saying, "Hey, can you please save my brand?" We've had like 30, 40, 50% failure rates on clogging, on leaking. Dispensaries and retail chains won't take my brand anymore. So why take a chance on ruining your brand? You only get one first impression in a lot of these markets. And again, just going back to you get for what you pay for, and you pay for peace of mind, especially in the vape space.
So any final thoughts that you want folks to come away with before we jump into to some Q&A and wrap up?
There's so much product choice when it comes to the vaporizer category that it's really up to the consumer to educate themselves on what's going to work best for them. That education is challenging because every brand presents themselves a little bit differently. But the more that a user can do to learn about the cannabinoids, the profile, the hardware that they're in, they're going to find the best fit for themselves and allow them to really enjoy the experience the most. So the more that people can dig in and learn about the brands that they're consuming, the better experience that they're going to have.
All you, sir.
Okay. From a brand perspective, kind of taking it back to the vape report and some of the numbers that we were seeing on the screen earlier, for these MSOs or single state operators or licensed producers, intimately understanding the markets that you're selling into. David, you had brought up a good point in the Canadian market, seeing some really big shuffling of key players in, who the number one cartridge seller or disposable seller. The brands that are leading in those categories today are selling the products that are selling the most. And that's not a mistake. They did that because they understood the markets and the trends in which it was going, and they stayed ahead of their competition, and now they're leading the categories in their markets.
Yeah, and maybe to cap it off, I'll go even broader and go in the vape space specifically for folks that are looking to get in and or expand their brand, or for end users that may watch this down the road. It's about doing your research. It's about finding good partners. And for the end consumer, it's about purchasing through legal avenues. Vape is something that, as we've seen through some of the VapeGate stuff that happened about a year ago, any additive can be put in. But if it's going through the proper channels and it's ending up in legal retail shops, that it's gone through some sort of regulation process, health check, and you're at least purchasing something and supporting the right side of the industry versus picking up something off of a corner and not knowing what was actually put into that vape cartridge. And that I can't stress that enough. It's important to go the legal route for health and safety reasons.
Right.
Excellent. Sarah, do you have any Any questions?
Yes, there are a couple questions. So this is out to the whole group. So feel free to jump in. But the first one is about packaging. So this person would enjoy hearing about trends of brands putting more of the full cannabinoid and terpene details on their vape packaging to help consumers better identify their desired products. Can you guys talk a little about this? It could be both Jesse and the Green Tank team.
Yeah, one thing I'll start with on that front is that cannabis is a hugely complex space for especially new consumers, right? When you look at something like alcohol, leaving aside the fact that Americans understand alcohol and grew up with sort of alcohol in public spaces, it's always a beverage. There are a few use cases that are sort of the socially acceptable use cases that people use it for. You know that there's the alcohol percentage on the packaging, and you have a rough sense of how much alcohol it takes you to get where you need to be. For a new cannabis consumer, right, there's already just dealing with the form factors, right? Unlike alcohol, which is a drink. Maybe it's beer, maybe it's wine, maybe it's liquor, but it's always a drink. Cannabis is a drink, or flower that you smoke, or flower that you vaporize, or a vape cartridge, or disposable cartridge, or a proprietary cartridge, or a concentrate, what wax, butter, right? Like there are already so many things to get across to cannabis consumers that I would caution brands from against sort of throwing too much information at early new consumers. Now, if what you're targeting is consumers who understand cannabis, they know what they're looking for, they understand things like terpene profiles, then yeah, absolutely include what are the terpenes in this, and what are the minor cannabinoids and the ratios. But we've seen some brands in spaces like edibles, like Kiva, for example, really split up and create different product lines. So their Petra mints are targeted at new consumers, and it's 5 milligrams THC in a mint, and or maybe it's 2.5 milligrams THC in a mint. That's what it is. That's the information you get. But they also have several other product lines made for progressively more, to call it cannabis nerdy people, that include a lot more information about minor cannabinoids, terpene profiles, things like words like solventless, which to a new consumer mean nothing. It's just a source of confusion and like too much information. So I think brands need to like identify who their customers are. And that's something we help with a lot on the consulting side, is who are your customers and how much do they know about cannabis, and how do you get those customers that you want to buy your products?
Thanks, David. Anybody else? Jesse, I'm sure you're seeing this more and more.
Yeah, conversely to that, I had an interesting discussion with Candescent last week at Hall of Flowers. They're one of the brands that actually marketed towards feeling, right? They had Charge, they had Create, they had Relax. They found that wasn't enough information. So they've actually started to include their strain names within their products, which is a change in their marketing campaign. But they've seen an increase in sales because of those changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe to tackle it from the Canadian market, there's only so much you can put on your packaging. So you're kind of up to the training of the bud tenders from a brand perspective versus the packaging or vape cartridge standpoint.
That's great. Thanks, guys. And it still blows my mind about your packaging. I mean, it's, I guess, a blessing and a curse, because sometimes, the California market is just oversaturated with it, but I still find that fascinating. All right. Let's see. There are a few more. So this Kimberly Williams is asking, how much roughly, if she wants to get into the vape and oil industry, would it cost to launch a business? I know that's kind of an open-ended question with a lot of other questions, but what kind of education would you recommend for someone new starting in this industry? And I guess specifically along, oils and vapes and things like that, aside from the Arcview Group, which you're tuning into today and learning this stuff. Sorry, got to get a plug in.
Yeah, it's and Jesse, you probably got an opinion, Derek, as well. I would start with market research. What state or province or city are you looking to launch? There's ways to work with toll processors that can help lessen the blow of actually having to go out and capitalize at a huge amount to own your own rigs for extraction. On the cartridge standpoint or disposable standpoint, again, it comes back to, are you looking to launch with one or two or three different platforms? That obviously may stretch out the capital a little bit further. So it really, back to David, to your point a minute ago, you need to dial in on who's the customer you're going after, what does that market segment look like, and then how do I capitalize appropriately for that? You could probably go out and raise a couple $1 million and be more than fine in a small subset of the market over, a couple months to get up and running, or you could go raise $100 million and go after the big MSOs. Really anything in between, but I'd say it starts with the research and then understanding who you're going after and making sure that you're going about it efficiently, just because there is a lot of competition in the space right now.
Yeah, just go ahead. To spin right off of that, it's a good idea to get a handle on your costs. The cannabis market is extremely competitive. So have an understanding of what your oil, what your hardware, what your packaging, what your distribution is going to cost you, and then factor that in and make sure that your target price point for that market is attainable and make sure that you can scale your business with that.
Yeah, there's so much variability from market to market because of the really dramatically different regulatory landscapes and cost and availability of licensing. There isn't sort of an easy answer on that front. But, we've seen brands launch with as little as tens of thousands of dollars in sort of extreme low end cases, not always successfully, but certainly it's possible in some markets. And we regularly help brands launch with millions or tens of millions of dollars. So it depends what market you're in, how big your ambition is, whether you want to make your own products or you slap a brand on something that's co-manufactured, all sorts of questions there. When it comes to education, obviously sort of attending stuff like this, and Arcview Group puts out a lot of really great educational content in the form of reports and webinars and things like that. But also I'd encourage you to check out Amsterdam University. They have courses for cultivation. They're launching a home grow course soon. They've got courses for extraction specifically. They've got courses targeted at folks who want to run cannabis businesses and understand sort of the intricacies of launching and operating a cannabis business. And we actually partnered with Amsterdam to launch a course specifically to help understand cannabis fundraising. So if you're looking to raise capital and really want help understanding how does one go about what are the terms that are involved in raising capital in the cannabis space, I'd encourage you to check that out.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists today. It's always a treat to have these subject matter experts on our virtual stage. And thank you, David, for also moderating that. Just a reminder that there is that poll. So if you haven't filled it out, we would appreciate it. It just helps us drive our programming decisions. And this is a wrap on our digital programming for 2021. And please join us at NCIA's conference in San Francisco tomorrow through Friday. And very excitingly, our Chief of Staff, Laura Toomey, will be moderating a panel on gender equity on Friday, December 17th. So check that out. And additionally, we also have a number of our Women's Inclusion Network members on various panels at NCIA. So definitely join those either virtually or in person. And join us again in 2022 as we resume our Arcview Access programming and state-by-state town halls. So with that, we'll close. Wishing you and your loved ones a wonderful and safe holiday season and an early Happy New Year's, and go out and enjoy that cannabis. Bye.